my name is Dr. Ty-Ria Jenkins, and today I will be walking you through my summative assessment data review. Throughout this session, I will walk you through our summative assessment data review with three main goals in mind. First, I wanted us to analyze the assessment data beyond just percentages and really identify trends, misconceptions, and subgroup differences. Second, I focus on helping us evaluate gaps, not only in student learning, but also in our instruction and assessment practices. And finally, I aim for us to leave with clear, actionable next steps, thinking about reteaching, differentiation, and instructional adjustments. I really approached this as more than just reviewing scores. It was about understanding what the data was telling us to do next. Our section will start with a quick overview of the assessment composition, then move into data analysis from both days of the mock assessment, and we'll spend most of the time unpacking what the data revealed. I intentionally closed with next steps because I wanted to make sure that the conversation stayed focused on action and not just those observations. As I reviewed the assessment, I grounded myself in what was actually being measured. From my experience, I've learned that analyzing data without understanding the design of the assessment can lead to misinterpretation. So when actually building the assessment, it was important for me to show teachers how you can look at the blueprint for your state testing, which for us is SC rating, and use those guidelines to create formative assessments and summative assessments along the way that have that same caliber of rigor. So I reflected on whether the items were truly aligned to the standard, whether they measured the depth of understanding, and whether students had multiple opportunities to demonstrate their thinking. I kept coming back to the idea that sometimes what looks like a student gap can actually point to an assessment design issue, especially when you're comparing assessment and you're seeing that there are gaps. Sometimes teachers will say, well, that's apples to oranges. They're not the same assessment. But as you begin to build and create assessments, you can create opportunities where it is apples to apples by just layering in some of those same structured qualities. And for this assessment, one of those big areas in which I wanted to highlight was the DOK levels and looking at those weights and mimicking how those can look not only for day one of the assessment, but also day two of the assessment. In addition to ensuring that students are having the opportunity to practice stamina, because mostly formative assessments have been in the 10 to 15 range, but with a summative assessment being a 2-day, as they will see in the spring with their SC Ready assessment, and then also being 25 questions each day um, to give us the data in terms of what we would need to see where their stamina is, and then also assess where they are academically in their mastery of the indicators that have already been taught. I also considered the differences between day one and day two in terms of pacing, exposure, and their overall ratings. The State Department actually provides for each specific reporting category the number of items in which students could possibly see, or the range of the number of items that students can possibly see when they take the assessment. So based off of these weighted items, each day were then broken down into how many questions would be selected for each reporting category that kind of reflected what students would see in the spring. Because in my experiences, the factors of pacing, exposure, and readiness always show up in the data. So it's important for me to make sure that to keep that context in mind as we went through and would later analyze the results. I wanted to ensure that we understood the data reflected the full instructional experience and not just a specific single moment in time in which students were being assessed. Being that this test was a mock assessment being used to prepare students for their spring state assessment, it was important to mimic the testing conditions as closely as possible. One of the major things in which we did to do so that we will also have consistency among those grade levels that will be taking that mock assessment, is to also provide teachers with a guidance of how they would actually issue the test. So what you see on your screen now is just the alignment of those expectations. So just as teachers are to read off expectations and directions during the state assessment, we use the structure of the state assessment and built it in for the mock assessment as well, so that everyone within their testing environment was hearing the same thing. Everyone had access to the same scratch paper, and those expectations were put in place prior for students testing. This was very important in terms of having students be within an environment that would mimic testing in hopes of producing the scores or similar to the scores in which they were produced on SC rating, by having that time to where the school is dedicated to that testing environment. The hallways are quiet. Students are working during that same time. We're not having over the intercom interruptions, so that we can have it as closely aligned as possible. When I looked at day one data, a few trends stood out to me. There were 3 students in the 90 to 100% range, 8 students in the 80s, and only 2 students in the 70s, and 13 students in the 60s. This told me that a large portion of students were performing in the approaching or below proficiency range. Based on my experience, when I saw that many students clustered in that 60s, I recognized that it likely pointed to a whole group instructional gap or a shared misconception rather than isolated student struggles. And this was just looking at the data prior to actually looking at the specific questions that was asked. This is solely just looking at the data and how students performed overall. When I compared that to day 2 data, I noticed some growth. There was 1 student in the 90 to 100 range, 15 students in the 80s, 6 students in the 70s, and 4 students in the 60s. This showed me that students were progressing, but we still weren't seeing a strong number reaching mastery. I interpreted this as evidence that instruction was moving students forward, but not yet pushing enough students to that deeper understanding. Prior to our data dig deep dive, teachers were provided with the data analysis protocol that you see on your screen. This data protocol was a little different from ones that were used in the past in terms of looking at data, as it also pulled out for teachers to specifically look at their whole class data in comparison to identified subgroup data to see their performance. It did still include the guiding questions for teachers being able to analyze the data, and the component for them to plan for what would they do next, or what were their next steps in instruction after actually analyzing the data. I think it's also important to include the scratch paper that students were provided when taking the assessment on day 1 and day 2. Given for SC rating, students will be given a blank piece of scratch paper in order to do their scratch work for their assessment. What I shared and explained with teachers is, with SC rating, is used as a snapshot of time to look at their students' mastery and see how they progressed over the year. Students are not necessarily given feedback on the questions for SC rating, and as a whole is not really used to drive further instruction. Whereas with this specific summative assessment, this mock test, we wanted to use this assessment to kind of gauge where we would go instructionally for the rest of the quarter prior to testing, and how to, intentionally spiral back in some of those standards in which students hadn't met mastery on. And what was important as well, instead of just guessing or assuming, what students were doing because the test is taken electronically, is having the scratch paper so that we can look at and identify those trends through those student work samples. Because it's one thing to assume, but it's another thing to be able to actually look at those work problems and be able to see where those misconceptions are so we can plan accordingly for how we support those students. So this was a structured piece of scratch paper that students use on each of those testing days to be able to work out their problems, if it was questions that required them to work it out or not, but for them to be able to have it so that we could refer back to student work instead of just making assumptions as to why they may have missed a problem or why they may have gotten one right. Question one was a question that received 100% accuracy. The teacher for this specific class was very excited to see that students had 100% mastery of this particular problem, especially with them being able to use the models and identify the different area factor pairs that matched. Um, Also, a big area in which students were working on in terms of item types was selecting all that apply. She said they have really worked hard on being able to break down questions that had this format so that students were looking at all the options and choosing the ones that most closely align with what the question was saying. So she was real excited um, about students being able to do it. She felt that they were prepared, and as they were going through it within the classroom, this reflected what she was seeing in terms of their understanding of how those models are built with those factor pairs and being able to match those up. So um, there was 100% success with this particular question. Question five also received 100% accuracy. When speaking with the teacher and as we were looking through the student work samples, she was very excited about this particular question as well. They had been given patterns and format. A lot of it had been vertical in like input output tables as opposed to it being horizontal. So when looking at this question and students having to determine what the pattern is and what the different ones would be as you continue the pattern, it was evident that regardless of them seeing it in a vertical format and seeing it in a horizontal format did not impact them being able to actually perform and do the skill of finding what that pattern is and adding on to find the next. So this question also had that 100% accuracy. Number six also had 100% accuracy. With this particular question, it was another select all that applied, so that was one of those item types that the teacher had been working with students on with being able to navigate and knowing that they had to look at all options and pick the options that corresponded to what the question was asking. It also incorporated the usage of a number line to do those comparisons. So something that the teacher shared as we were going through the data, looking at our students' work samples, and looking at, for one, students who actually chose to use that scratch paper and put down student work. We've seen a lot of students actually redrawing that number line, and then we saw them plotting the actual points on the number line. And I guess they were using that for the comparison. So that was real nice to see that although they were already given the number line, but having them actually plot the points and do those comparisons on their own to be able to determine which ones fit and which ones were true and which ones were not. So um, this question also had that 100% accuracy. On to conversion and measurements. So number four actually received 31% accuracy. And this particular problem worked with students with doing conversions. And what came out as we were looking at this question was that this particular standard indicator had not been taught yet. So as I was talking with the teacher, I told her that, it's okay. In terms of course, we would like to see the accuracy higher, but at least she knows as she's going into teaching it, which will be because they're currently about going to spring break. But once she gets back from spring break and she goes into teaching conversions, then she has some baseline data that she's able to look at because at least she's not starting from zero. Some students have an understanding of what's needed for those conversions, in addition to also thinking and being proactive about how within the assessment for SC Ready, students will have to know how to do the conversions, but they'll also be provided with a conversion table. So as she's going through and teaching it for the first time, ensuring that as she's teaching the students how to do conversions, that she's also giving them opportunities to practice and interact with that conversion table so that they're able to use that as an aid. So this really kind of gave her pre test data so that as she goes in after spring break and start talking about measurement and conversions, that she has some background to those students who kind of have an understanding, or she can see, hey, was it just luck? But based off of those work samples, those students who did get it correct had some understanding of how to convert those measurements. But then, just showing them too how they can use that conversion table as an aid. Number 24 received 15% accuracy. And this is also going to be pre-data for this teacher, as she shared they hadn't quite gotten into time yet. And also we're looking at the structure of the question. She did go ahead and make note of, as she's talking about time and talking about half an hour and talking about 1/4 an hour in terms of using fractions to talk about time. We talked about how important it will be to have students be able to make those correlations. So even if she did an activity in terms of it, because normally how she was teaching time was like as an open number line, but also thinking about it as if you fold that the clock into fourths. And she said she's actually going to do it as an activity and have them to shade the different quadrants on that clock on the clock when she breaks it into fourths. But have them know that a fourth of an hour is 15 minutes, a half of an hour is 30 minutes, 3/4 of an hour is 45 minutes, so that they can have that visual. Um, so that was something that came out of this that's important for next steps as she goes into do instruction without just looking at it as a number line, but then also looking at it as how does this relate to fractions. And then she said even if it said like 25 hundredths of an hour, so even as they go into decimals, what kind of introducing them to what that may look like as well. So that was some things that we took from this question to be able to inform the instruction for once she actually goes into teaching them about time and how that will relate um, going forward. Lastly, number 16 received 19% accuracy. This is another standard indicator in which the teacher had not taught, so she will be using it as pre-data where conversions is being done. So like I shared about 2 slides back with this particular type questions with conversion, it gave the teacher information in terms of how she can use this data to help inform how she actually delivers the instruction with students and provide those conversion chart aids to support them as they're doing it. So she has a plan already created for that. So for next steps, um, we decided as a whole to focus on that targeted reteaching, prioritizing the most critical gaps instead of just reteaching everything. Also ensuring that as students are completing additional formatives in between, that they are exposed to different type of item types. Continuing with some of the big ones like select all that apply in addition to some drag and drops in which students had struggled with prior. Ensuring also that there is an alignment of resources for students so that they're not just receiving those DOK 1 level questions, they're also having DOK level 2 and 3, so not just that basic recall. Up until testing, students will continue with their focused small group instruction. Small group will be shifted some based off of how students performed on this assessment to better meet their needs and get more scaffolding and support and direct instruction and aid from a teacher during that small group time. And then the teacher will ensure that as she's working with students that she's closely monitoring for all students where they are and working to close those gaps across those different groups for those different learners. This template was used to support teachers as they created further plans for how they can support students as they go through quarter 4. It included the specific indicators based off of those mock tests in which students needed to have spiraled back in, and different sections to where teachers strategically plan that small group support. They think about how those weekly assessments are going to look as they go on to teach other indicators. How would they be strategic about spiraling some of those indicators that they've already taught that they need students need more practice with, or to be assessed on to see where they are currently with mastering, in addition to what instructional resources they're going to use. So being intentional about what it is that they're pulling and selecting to be able to provide students those opportunities to show mastery. Overall, I left this experience reflecting not just on student performance, but on my own instructional decisions. This process pushed me to think more intentionally about alignment, rigor, and responsiveness. Overall, it reinforced for me that data analysis is not just about identifying gaps, but it's about using those insights to make meaningful instructional change.